Guys, we are streaming live. So welcome for those who are watching us online. We have a couple of viewers already. I assume they are not from Europe. Maybe they are. I think it's very, very early in the morning here in Europe, but maybe some people are joining. Anyway, so what I'd like to do is I'm going to start with a little background on how we got to where we are, and then I'll ask you each to give a little intro of yourselves, and then we'll jump into the questions. So this is the Design for Tomorrow Awareness Initiative, and we've been having events for the last 5 weeks, and we have events next week as well. Initially, it started off as an awareness week, but we had so many great people joined and it had to be extended. And basically, we're talking about any topic and all topics relating to the theme of Design for Tomorrow. And this is a panel on design and education. And so, it's really great to have you all here. So we'll go in the order that you all joined, and I think Catherine, you can start first.
Thank you, Candice. It's wonderful to be here, and thank you for the invitation to be part of this panel with Robert and Tiziana. It's my first time actually meeting Robert, and Tiziana and I met at UX Copenhagen. It's great to meet you. And I'm a design director at Pluralsight, which is a global software as a service platform for education and training and workforce transformation. And I also participate in a PhD program at the University of Melbourne in Australia. And I'm a sessional academic from time to time at the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology School of Design here in Melbourne.
Great. Very cool. All right, Tiziana.
All right, so my name is Tiziana and I live in San Diego, California, and I'm a UX psychologist consultant as well as an educator. I teach a few different schools right now at the Point Loma Nazarene University, as well as the New School of Architecture and Design. And I'm usually teaching about behavioral design, interaction design, experience design, and topic as well. So I feel very passionate about the topic of tonight because I feel that we are at the point in which we really need to start changing the way new designers are trained. So I'm very grateful for this opportunity.
So thank you very much. And Robert?
Super. Well, it's great to be on this panel. I've been looking forward to this and look forward to the discussions. I'm sure it'll be quite interesting. My background is rather lengthy given my age. I'm currently an emeritus principal scientist at an organization called SRI International, which used to be part of Stanford University, used to be Stanford Research Institute. They spun off a number of years ago. We're located in Silicon Valley. I'm located in San Francisco. Prior to being at SRI, I was on faculty at the University of Michigan in the area of educational technology and taught graduate courses in instructional design, software design, instructional psychology, and so on. Prior to that, I was actually a grade school teacher in the inner city of Detroit, so I bring that experience. After retiring from SRI, I was a consultant for many years, working with ministries of education around the world, multinational organizations such as UNESCO and the World Bank, OECD, and high-tech companies such as Intel, Microsoft, Cisco, working with countries on their technology policy and how technology could be used to reform education in ways that prepared students for the information society and the knowledge economy. And most recently, I just finished, just published a book called Make the World a Better Place, Design with Passion, Purpose, and Values. There's a chapter in there on basically on education. It's on advancing knowledge and agency. So I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Wonderful. I think you all have really great backgrounds for the questions that we have. And yeah, I think this is going to make a very interesting panel, because I think you have all like, yeah, a nice collection of skills or experience. And that brings us to the first question that I'd like to ask you. So what sort of new skills need to be taught if the design moves from emphasis on artifact to impact, from humanity-centered or human-centered to humanity-centered, and if it moves from studio to community?
Mhm.
I'm gonna leave it up to you to just have a discussion. Whoever has
I propose that question, so I suppose the onus is on me. I actually think we're at quite a pivotal time in the development of design as a profession. Kind of historically, it's moved out of originally a kind of more technical, analytical engineering approach during the Industrial Revolution, and its implementation through the mid-20th century. And we're moving into a phase of design, or at least I hope we are, that's conveyed by those questions, from human-centered to humanity-centered, out into the community, focusing on impact, not just the development of products and services. And I think it does have implications for a wide variety of new skills for designers, that moves it out of kind of the insular silos that design has often been taught as product design or user interface design, experience design, fashion design, architecture, and so on, to a much, I think, broader perspective on design, thinking of design as a fundamental way that human beings address and solve problems. So if we're thinking about design, not so much as the artifact, as the product or as the experience, but as the solution to a problem, then we need a different set of skills. Certainly part of that needs to be the assessment of the impact of the design. Otherwise, we don't know if the problem's been solved. I think traditionally, if you look at the double diamond, the design process ends with delivering the product or the experience, and the designer is finished with the design. On the other hand, if we're solving problems, we're not finished. We have to make sure that the problem is solved, and that we haven't kind of created other problems in the process, and particularly haven't created harm with our products. So I think that skills related to assessment of impact, and of course that will depend on the nature of the problem that's being addressed. And it's also quite a complex process, because often the most difficult problems are the ones that are most difficult to measure the impact. So certainly evaluation, assessment skills are going to be important. I think as we engage the community in finding out what it is the problems are that they're facing, there are a whole set of interpersonal skills that designers need to develop related to mediation, coaching, interpersonal skills that allow the designer to engage with the community, get information from the community, resolve conflicts within the community that allow the design to move forward. These are a whole set of skills that traditionally have not been part of design, and we think more of social workers or even teachers who are designers. If we think about design in this grander way of solving human problems.
Mm-hmm. But does that then mean that designers take on more roles from more professionals? So, for example, I mean, I've recognized a lot of these sort of concepts, and one of the areas that I work on is CSR, but traditionally that has been business strategy, that has been analysts and corporate analysts working on that. And when we are in the office in especially the sort of luxury markets, everybody always tries to push their work onto the next guy. How do we when the designer's toolkit includes business analysis and stakeholder management, how do we ensure that there's not too much burden placed on the shoulders of designers?
Well, if I can answer that, I think what I don't see like designer becoming perfect at everything. To me, feels one of the biggest skill that we can teach students right now, or younger designer, is cooperation and co-design. Meaning, like, you don't have to be a business analyst. You don't have to be a specialist in in everything. But what it is important is to understand those problematic. So understanding that you're not just doing a little tiny piece, but you're an integral part of a process, which means that you need to work together and develop those skills of collaboration so that everybody can sit on a table and trying to solve all those complex issues. Also because they're not a single simple problem to fix. It's not like, oh, how can we sell this product? Those problems that we are trying to solve, or we would love to solve, has been built over decades and decades and decades and decades. It's not something that happened at the last moment, so we can't fix it in a week or even like 6 months or even a year. So it's important to understand, in my opinion, that those are really complicated problems, and that means you have a part to play. You're not going to be the only one fixing it. You're going to be one piece of the solution, but you need to be able to understand that you have to work with other people. So just changing the way of thinking from, okay, I'm a designer, I'm just going to do this little tiny thing, versus, no, I'm just part of this huge team. Even if you're in a small company, still, like, there are other different points that you have to consider. And there is, like, he was talking about, Robert was talking about, business, but there are also like sustainability, like you mentioned, but there are also, issue of equity and understanding, the trauma-informed communities and all sort of other things. So to me, I think the biggest gift we can give as in teachers to the student is to teach them to see the broader picture. It's not just straightforward. There is so much more around it, and you're not maybe the expert in sustainability, or you're not the expert in accessibility, but you're aware that this is a crucial part, and you're gonna look for the expert you can work with, if that makes sense.
Yes, totally. Do you have something to say, Catherine?
Yeah, just building on the previous comments here from Tiziana and Robert, and also yours, Candice. My observation is really that it's becoming more relational. The way designers work, relationships is so important, especially for those design outcomes and the impact assessments that we're talking about, to have that alignment in corporations or organizations or in student settings, to understand that that's actually part of the job. And that's not something that people are naturally taught in curriculum. I've noticed that more and more in the delivery of, say, for example, the UX expertise module that I've been teaching over the last few years, if not 5 years now, we've evolved it because it's needed to respond to the pressures on designers in the sense that managing the expectations of the students in terms of what they should be doing when they go out into the industry, understanding that they may not have the domain expertise. And in past incarnations of design education, it would have been responding to a brief. Often in modern delivery, it's usually of design solutions, it's usually co-designed, participatory designed instances of briefs, which are iterative and adaptive based on solution adaptation. So I suppose it's really contextual, and it's really interesting. I think we've touched on a few topics, but what I'm learning about now in my personal education is actually the different domains around ethics and philosophy. And I think we've gone through phases where psychology has been really interesting, and Tiziana's an expert in psychology with the qualifications and background. A lot of designers have been dipping into psychology domains for information to help them do their jobs. Now it's ethics and philosophy, which I think is really interesting because we're all concerned with the outcomes. And we're not necessarily supported by principles or governance all the time to support those outcomes, which I think is fascinating, and it's almost like a wicked problem across industry and profession.
And this sort of, sorry, Tiziana, you can go first.
I just want to add just one little thing about what Catherine was mentioning about the intersection with philosophy and ethic, and brings back what Robert was talking about business, because I feel as designers, we need to be also very practical. And so I feel that, in maybe just my position for it, but it seems like that, especially for younger designer, the more practical you make it, the easier it will be. As in, like, okay, ethics, design, and psychology, because it's good business. And I'm not saying that it shouldn't, it should be like that. Everybody should have, the idea of do good because you should be doing good and learning philosophy. But I noticed that with younger designer, at least in my case, I noticed that is a lot easier to kind of quote unquote sell that message if you can tie it to the bottom line. Also because it makes it easier for them to sell it to their bosses and to their versus like, oh, let's have a beautiful discussion about what's ethical and what's ethics and that kind of stuff. A lot of business people was like, glaze over and fall asleep.
Well, but that also, because the way that business has evolved and is evolving, and the way that design evolves. And so, we're building the world as we're going. And of course, there's a lot of learnings to take on. As a designer, where I worked on a project where I was sort of mapping all of so there were various teams working together, and one was print, one was e-com, one was PR, and everybody is sort of creating digital assets to publish out into the world. Some were for print, some were for digital. And there was always like sort of issues aligning on, getting it in the right format, getting it on time, agreeing on how we activate and blah, blah, blah. And, I had to map the processes of each person and sort of find the weak points and, design a solution for that. And during this exercise, one thing that really struck me, and this was also this period, it was also outside of this exercise, but especially this exercise is a beautiful example because there were multiple teams and the same patterns emerged. Excuse me. And these patterns were sort of like power struggles. And when we're talking conceptually, I want to be a good designer. I want to have the right skills, but at some stage, the expectations and the sort of burdens placed on a designer can be so much that they can, there's so many considerations. So how do we keep business fair? How do we keep the professional groupings fair so that everybody sort of carry their own equal weight?
Yeah, I'd like to respond to that, and it kind of goes back to your earlier comment, Candace, about the kind of undue burden that we place on designers to solve the world's problems. And I think that if we think of design in this broader sense of solving problems, it's really a shared responsibility. I think designers bring a particular mindset and a particular set of skills, a growing set of skills, I think, that not only include the kind of technical and technological skills that we often associate with design, but as mentioned a moment ago, these kind of grounding in psychology, grounding in ethics, grounding in social sciences. So they bring that to play in solving the problem. But I think the other players, if you will, the other collaborators in the co-design process can come to be designers in their own right. If we think of this as a shared responsibility. So, for example, we can get, when I say we, I mean designers can help the people that we're working with, whether they're teachers or social workers or doctors or lawyers, to begin to think like designers so that they can bring that mindset to bear along with their expertise in solving the problems. And let me give you a specific example of that. There's a case study that I focus on in my book, and this is actually from an organization in your neighborhood, Tiziana, and in San Diego, called High Tech High. And it started off as one high school named High Tech High, but it's actually over the last 10 years become a whole network of high schools, middle schools, even grade schools. What is particularly unique about this system of schools, and there are many things, is that the whole system is built around design as a meta construction, so that all of the students, and whether they're grade school or primary students, middle school students, high school students, all of the students are engaged in design projects. And they, and as part of that, they're learning to be designers, but they're also learning to solve problems. What's also interesting is that the teachers are explicitly designers. That is, there is in their teacher professional development, they take courses in design, in creating designs, in creating design challenges, design problems, in helping students become designers. So the whole school system at all levels and all segments is organized around this meta construct of design. So if everybody brings this this construct to the table and each has their own contribution they can make, then design serves as this kind of glue that brings everything together to solve problems. And I think this is this high tech high and the network of schools related to it is a great example of that can be brought to bear in other professions, law, medicine, other professions. Basically, a profession is there to solve a problem or solve sets of problems, whether it's architecture, medicine, teaching, social work. We're all solving problems. And if we can use design as the lens of which we not only view these problems, but communicate with each other around the solutions, then I think we can really bring the power of design to bear on the world's problems.
Each area that you study has got a different focus. So, for example, when I was studying law, the primary core was language and argumentation. So understanding, how you can argue for your client and bring a message across. And with design, one of the the core for me has always been problem solving. That's who we are. Now, to become a professional, there's a lot happening in the world, and there's a lot of general stuff that we can partake in. But when we study, we sort of focus, we narrow down, and we we look beyond. We ignore a lot of things just so that we can have a focus. When we have such a broad landscape, what sort of tools, what sort of skills can we develop to be able to have a fluid focus, where instead of having that specialization, that one thing that we master, having these transferable and dynamic skills, so that we can then be able to work on this broad field.
Well, I remember by mentioning this, a really good analogy that a front-end developer named Brett Frost made, which and he was talking about how a lot of time people talk about you should have a T-shaped knowledge in which you're pretty broad, but you're very focused on one. And I remember the point he made is that is a great idea, but if you put a T by itself, it will fall down. Versus if you put 7 different T's, or even 2, if you want, in which is like 2 individuals that have overlapping broad knowledge, but they each specialize in one, this is how you can actually accomplish something. So I feel my theory, and we'll see if it's true or not, but my theory is if we train students, new designers from the beginning, from like year 1 or whenever they start, to know that there are those broader expectations. So there is, when you design, you have to think about the environment, and you have to think about the people you're designing for, and you have to think about inclusion and equity and all those kind of things. I feel that it becomes their normal, their default. And then you can build whatever else specialized skills. I think that will really give them a good foundation. And I had to say that I feel that the younger generation now, the Gen Z, are much more sensitive and receptive to this kind of discussion. Like in my son's school, which is not going to high tech high, we did think about it, but it wasn't right for him. but he has a regular public school. But in his public school, I know we just went to open house. His English teacher, talked about the curriculum for this year, and it was a lot of emphasis about activism and social justice. And I mean, granted, this is California, but they were like reading like about
not Florida.
Yeah, it's not Florida or Texas that just banned, Anne Frank graphic novel. But it was nice to see that was not like a weird thing. It was just part of the curriculum. We're going to be talking about different issues, and they're going to be reading The Kai Runner. And, my son is in 10th grade, 16. So I know. So I like to think that the younger generation will be more open for it. And in fact, if anything, maybe they will even ask for it. They will be a lot more aware of what's going on in the world. And I feel that with the advent of AI, how it's coming up so quickly, those kind of skills going to be even more valuable. The human skills, the ability to see problem, the ability to do those connections and to be kind of cross-discipline, I think it will become even more valuable.
One thing that I encountered frequently in my career is, as a designer, your core is problem solving, and often you come up with a lot of business solutions. And not only the business, but also the people, the other teams profit a lot out of these solutions. However, power battles and power struggles has ensured that creatives, including designers, are some of the most exploited and harassed of all professions. So for me, it's very clear. For me, design basically helps build the business. Creativity, innovation, and design, basically, without this core, there's no business. This is the core that every business needs to engage as a business in the world. Burnout is increasing, and all these mental blocks is increasing because all of this weight is on the shoulders of the designers, and they're not always fairly treated, and they're not always fairly paid. So is there any training, any education? Are you starting that in the universities where you say, okay, look, with big responsibilities?
I'm not aware of that happening in the undergraduate area, although the lecturers and teachers might be speaking about that. It comes down to the exposure to industry, because as a sessional academic, I come in from industry, and I'm not 100% in academia, so I do have that lens on the situation. And I guess one of the motivations to teach was because of that, because of the lack of preparedness when we had younger new designers coming in who are pretty fresh out of school or fresh out of education with expectations of what they could achieve, and seeing that sort of sense of reality setting in, and also that burnout, the burnout cycle occurring. As a leader, also having to counsel people through that, and having experienced edges of burnout myself, thinking about how I can help them and help them look after their well-being. And I think some of this comes through in the need for education to be modernised to respond to that. And we're seeing that with the World Economic Forum's Education 4.0, and that's impacting on our school systems. My daughter's also at school. She's just had a whole term of innovation focus, no curriculum based on standard curriculum topics. And that was all about critical thinking and problem solving, social impact. And it was fantastic to see her thrive from that exposure, and also to see her discuss that and talk to me about it as a person, a young person who's been exposed to that thinking. So I couldn't agree more with some of the things that Robert's mentioned, and also Tiziana. And I think that what I'm seeing is actually that kind of aggregate view around who is actually owning the design process, because in software, everybody owns it. There's no avoiding it. And it's really difficult for designers, because designers come in thinking, well, isn't this my responsibility? But there's quite a few studies out there that show and demonstrate that people in other roles and titles actually own part of the process that would be considered to be, say, for example, user experience design.
Mhm.
And that makes it harder, because again, you've got that, what is the impact? Where is my role? And that facilitation role is really important. So being able to orchestrate and bring people together to inhabit the design process and understand it.
Yeah, I think it's also a little bit responsibility, because ultimately it is a shared process, but often we are accountable, we're responsible. And when you have to answer for the choices of other people, that's where the issue comes in. So I've seen a lot of dark psychology used in design, and then that comes down to the designer. Oh, why did you design it like this? Well, our company wanted to employ dark patterns. So, I think being a designer is increasingly more challenging, and there's a lot of issues to deal with. You can go really, really deep. But
I was going to say that that's an interesting problem, even just there talking about dark patterns, because who's the decision maker around what goes live or what's shipped out to the consumer? Often in software delivery, you might have other roles who are not schooled in design or may not care about the intentions of designers. And that's where we go back to the problem, which is, how is business and industry being educated now? Because we don't have the ability or scaffolding to do the roles that we expect to do, or have the outcomes we expect to drive, without that support.
Yeah. So when we're talking about education and design, we're not just talking about design, but in actual fact, the entire industry. All right.
Right. And as far as like dark pattern too, one thing I usually, well, first of all, new designer need to know what they are. So I start with that, because there's still plenty of people, they don't think there's anything wrong with it. And I see that even in my classroom. So that's the first step. But the other thing I always recommend is like get informed as much as possible, as in, again, trying to tie it back to the business, as in, if you're using the star pattern, you're going to lose this much money because of this. And the more data you can have and gather to back it up, the easier it will be. And then, of course, the legal threat, as in, like, this is illegal. As in, granted, if it's a big company, they probably say, oh, I don't really care. It's like, whatever, it's cheaper for me to pay the fine to actually do it. But I think with smaller companies, it is a lot more effective, even though they may not be enforced, but just let them then know. It's like, oh, I'm sure you're not aware of it, but this is actually legal. At least in California or Vermont or Europe or things like that. And most companies don't want to say, oh, okay, well, I mean, some company may react. I saw actually a company that refused to do business with California because of a law that was enacted on like payday loans. And so now they don't do business with California at all. But in general, most company, they don't want it to cut off one state or two state or one whole continent like Europe. So sometimes the owner may not really realize it, that is a dark pattern or deceptive pattern. They may just know, oh, I learned that in business school, that if if you do this, people will buy more. So they may not even think about, oh, maybe
Exactly.
that's not a good idea. So if you try to get as much data, it's like, well, people really not coming back to your company if you do that. And you're gonna lose customers, and that's gonna cost you this much money. I think that give you at least a weapon. And I saw other designer do create document and have their client or boss sign it, in which you say the designer expressly said, don't do this, but the client really insisted. So that, again, like you saying, is like, you can't just say, oh, it's the designer fault, because you have it in writing. That's like, okay, I'll do it if you sign this and say that it was your choice to do it. So I'm not saying it's perfect, but I think it could be at least one thing you could try. Oh, So cute. It's like the baby version of my cat. My cat is like 4 times as big, but
Yeah, she's the vet was like, oh, she's a girl. She's that big. She was like 6 months size at 4 months. So
oh,
she's going to be a giant.
well,
Yeah.
yeah.
There's also the
Um,
incentives around the designers. Say, for example, do you want to work at Meta? After
Yeah.
Cambridge Analytica, many designers would have said, no, I don't want to work at Meta, even though Meta pays well, fantastic incentives to be there from, a work-life perspective, and no doubt ways to accelerate your career by being at Meta. So there's a personal moral decision in the decision making around joining a company or doing a certain kind of client work. There's also the incentives around revenue loss or revenue gain based on what companies are willing to absorb into risk. So the designers might be saying we must have AA compliance. It just is a given. But until the major clients say, oh yes, we won't continue with you, we won't renew our contracts unless you become AA compliant, there's no business incentive.
I'm deviating a lot from the actual questions that I prepared you with, just because, the conversation's so interesting that it's generating questions for me. So one thing, as a lawyer, I'm not a professional lawyer. I did study a bit and I hung around, like I was surrounded by lawyers. I didn't move, naughty. No, my boy, come on. Oh my gosh, these kids. No, kittens. Oh my gosh, go away, guys. Sorry about that. So first off, in law, you're sort of always searching for the loopholes. You're always trying to make bad things palatable. And, the ethical considerations and the sort of moral considerations, I feel like there are so many professionals profiting off of an unfair and unjust world. And so when you are ethical, when you put these moral values on yourself, you're often not very successful. They don't hire you. So this is also sort of like a loop in the process for me, because I want to be ethical, but I've also been a single mom, and I needed to feed my kid and I couldn't anymore because of all the dark stuff, all the dark patterns. And it's legal in many cases, because there's always a new way to figure out a weakness. So okay, law catches up and then you rephrase it, and you make all of these bypasses and overpasses. And so when we're talking to these young people, and they obviously have a desire to do good in the world, to design a better world, how do we protect them from the industries and the actual humanity, if we're focusing on humanity, the true nature of humanity?
Maybe you
Well,
can. Go ahead, Robert.
Go ahead. Well, this was an important part of the book that I wrote, because the way I came at it was, what is good design? And typically, the way that we've defined design is rather narrow. If you look at many of the design contests around the world, it focuses quite narrowly on, this goes back to the artifact or the product rather than the impact. So it's the aesthetics of the product, or the functionality or the efficiency, or it looks at the product. And bringing this design as a problem-solving process to bear on this issue of what is good design, it really focuses on what are good impacts. So then it shifts the consideration of what makes a good design to this notion of, well, what kind of a world are we trying to achieve? So what I tried to do in the book is to identify not just what it is that we shouldn't do, we shouldn't create harm, which I think we've been kind of talking about for the moment. But what is it that we should be focusing on in our careers, in our jobs? What is it that we want to accomplish with our designs? So I dug into the philosophy of what is good, not just good design, but what is good about the world, and came up with 7 principles. The first one, do no harm. The second one is to reduce harm when you see it. The third is to increase well-being and happiness. The fourth is to advance knowledge and agency. Agency being giving people not just knowledge, but the skills they need to create their own happiness and contribute to the happiness of others. The kind of lost count here. The fifth, I believe, is to promote equality. The sixth is to address injustice, and the seventh is to create compassionate, supportive relationships and communities. So if we then kind of have this focus, that we're not just making money in our personal jobs or contributing to the corporate bottom line, but we're trying to create a better world. We're trying to create designs that have these purposes of increasing well-being, of addressing injustice, of creating communities and relationships. So those principles are ones that I propose as guiding designers in their own personal choices about the kinds of jobs that they consider, the kinds of projects that they take on. And I do provide a number of specific pragmatic strategies to use to help resolve issues around, well, yeah, but how do I make a living doing this? How do I take care of my kids and so on?
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah, and I think also it's very important to remember, that's another thing I like to talk about, that is not an absolute. It's not like you're either ethical or you're not ethical at all. I think it's very important to offer that kind of options as well, that like any progress is better than no progress. So if you are a starving student and you cannot afford to work for the company you would like to, obviously don't work for Meta, but you know, it's like sometimes you may have to do compromise. Is also like, okay, well, it's a long journey. Just take the first step. If you can just mitigate even a little bit, whatever you're doing, in my opinion, in my book, is already a win. And so I want the student to understand that it's not all or nothing, because it can be very discouraging, because obviously I am a certain age and I can afford to do certain choices. And, you know, if you're 20 and you're trying to, you know, make a living, you may not have the same opportunity or freedom to do the same choices, but still doing a little bit, in my opinion, is still a huge win. And I trying to make them understand that like you should celebrate any small win. Of course, the future goal hopefully will be better world and, you know, just fixing all those problems. But in the meantime, there's no point. It's like, well, I'm not going to even try because I can't do it. Just do whatever little bit you can do right now. and work towards what you would like to do. And I think that sometimes helps.
I think there are choices that we can provide for our students that help them think through not just the issues, but kind of career moves, how it is that they can start from the very beginning, thinking about jobs that not only bring an income, allow them to live and raise their kids and so on, but that contribute to making the world a better place explicitly. There are, of course, a lot of nonprofit organizations that they can consider, but there are also organizations. One of my favorites is an organization called 80,000 Hours. It's 80,000 hours, HOURS.com, or maybe .org. It's a clearinghouse of jobs that address the most difficult, complex, and important issues facing the world. So climate change, injustice, there are all of they identify specific issues that are doable, that can be addressed by design and problem-solving solutions, and they post jobs that advance these goals. And I think there are other organizations like that that we should include when students, as they finish their degree, kind of ask us about, well, what do I do to make, now that I'm a designer, what do I do to make a living? And what do I do to make the world a better place?
Yeah, I actually.
Another thing might be as well, Candice, just to reconcile what your intentions are morally, and ethically, with maybe running towards fires, maybe towards companies that you may not agree with, but touch many people. How can you actually assist those people and assist those companies without thinking you're going to change the system necessarily? There are ways of thinking through that, and also understanding when that might be too much. If you've tried to change too much, how do you avoid that burnout situation, or adopting a hero complex or savior complex when actually it can't be changed easily? So identifying that experience, that can be valuable for a designer. It can help them as a human to understand the nature of the world, and also the mechanics of the world and the difficulties they might face in industry. It might give them skills that they wouldn't have acquired in different environments. Those, pro bono or passion projects are important. I know that from a life stage perspective, even early to mid-career, it's very difficult, especially once people have home loans or children or responsibilities that require financial, funding. It's really hard to make those choices easily, as you said. And often I'm counselling or mentoring people through that process as well, because they might be getting hung up on these issues where things aren't perfect yet, and not thinking about that incremental process of improving things in their roles and how they can help their teams or have a better working environment together to have a better, more positive impact down the line, which is also possible.
It's not only getting hung up, but so around 2010, 2011, I really got into the Zeitgeist movement. Do you guys know the Zeitgeist? So basically, there's this guy, Jacques Frescal, and I believe he was an architect in background, but he started working on this project called the Venus, something. It's so long ago, and basically it is urban design, social design, and he created all these communities. And well, some challenges were surfaced, and actually I've encountered that quite a lot as well. Another group that I got involved with a couple of years ago was effective altruism, and this is also where I learned about the 80,000 hours. That said, and what I'm doing with Design in Focus, all of my time goes into this. I really give it wholehearted attention and dedication. But yeah, there's no rewards. My pocket keeps burning deeper and deeper. And sometimes there are even negative interactions. And when it comes to designing for tomorrow, designing for good, there is this main core that you're often the victim if you're trying to have these morals, and it is a dog eat dog world. It really is. They will maul you over if you're soft and squishy and kind and sweet. You've got to be firm, you've got to be strong, especially if you want to do good. You cannot be good and be nice. That's going to get you dead, or but yeah, I think my main challenge is that I can see how all of this really, I can see the value, I can see the impact, and I think it's very clear. And I think others also can see that. And yeah, where does it stop when passing the buck? And when you're young, you have this view of the world that the law exists, doesn't serve you in reality. You learn that later. There's all of these injustices in the world. So I'm a mother myself, and my child might think I'm negative if I'm trying to explain certain things to her, and I assume a lot of other young people are the same. But at the same time, you've got to give them the sort of tools to go out into the real world and have these battles. Are there programs at universities or at so many mosquitoes here? Sorry. Are there any programs specifically to develop sort of like secure? I don't really know how to term it yet. On one of the themes, I called it designer security. But yeah, methods and processes, how you can safeguard yourself very specifically against the repetitive behaviors which we encounter, like the abuse, the blame shifting, sort of claiming one person's work for another. That's it's sort of very real. And are there specific trainings for that? Like, can we go somewhere?
I think the Eric Mayer, who was that? Ethan Marcotte, who just wrote a book on You Deserve a Union. There's just a book just came out that's called your designer need a union or something like that, from a book apart. I don't think, as far as I know, there is, and again, you're speaking to people that live in the United States when there is no job security whatsoever in any field. You pretty much can be fired anytime and for any reason. There is no justification, no, you give 2 weeks and then you leave. There is no severance pay or anything like that. So I don't see how, I don't feel like designers are any worse than a lot of other here in the United States. If anything, they're better than Uber drivers or Amazon drivers, or, so I think it's very localized on the different countries, or in case of United States, in the different states. So it would be really difficult to found even a program. But I feel that at the end I always recommend to also do pro bono work in general, because not just because of the experience, not just because it's the right thing to do, but also because that's one way to create network and relationship that can help you throughout kind of a little bit as almost like a safety net, because you meet people sitting in those boards, which are usually people that are very successful and they probably have their own business. And so it's a great way to actually create connections.
Yeah.
I think that's probably the closest I could recommend the
Mhm.
student. And the other one is like, well, life is tough, you know, and not just for designers, it's hard for everybody.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there's really
I,
no
I, I think if we think of our students as part of a larger group of designers who are, if you will, a kind of fraternity, that they belong to the same profession. They're addressing some of the same problems. And if we can create a kind of sense of unity among students, rather than, okay, you go out there, it is a dog world, learn how to eat dogs. Then, I think we can have an impact in a positive way through the training, through the coaching, through the mentoring of our students. I think if you look at the here in California, the screenwriters strike and the actors strike, it has important lessons, absolutely critical lessons for designers, for, I should say, the rest of us designers, because screenwriters are very much designers. Actors and actresses are designers. They're all creatives. And what they're concerned about is not just their wages in a dog-eat-dog world, but the viability of their craft, given artificial intelligence, particularly these large language models, where somebody can, using ChatGPT, generate a script in a half an hour. Their screenwriters are very concerned about the viability of their profession, and they're acting collectively in response to that. And then if on top of ChatGPT, you take, say, Midjourney, which in a half a day, somebody can create a film clip that looks as slick as anything that that can come out of a week-long production process. I mean, this is a real threat to all of us as professionals, as creative professionals. And I think we need to be thinking much more collectively about the action that we can take as professionals, rather than just push our students out the door and say, good luck, you're on your own, learn how to eat dogs.
Right.
Yeah.
But don't they have a union, the screenwriter?
Yes, they do, and they're acting.
So we're going back to the fact that they're like not enough collective bargaining, union, and is, that's why I think Ethan Marcotte wrote that book. That is true. We need to have some kind of collective power, but it wouldn't be possible. It's basically impossible without a union. And again, in the United States, is really not an easy sell. So.
I think this
I
is
don't
also
think we have in design is the duty of care frameworks that health and education might have embedded into their training, and that I think is problematic because of all of the things that we're discussing right now around design. We're talking about duty of care and outcomes and well-being and human flourishing, and we may also be participants in the design of AI, or the consumers of those AI services and products. How do we look at that from a duty of care perspective, and do businesses and government have that role, you know, because that's still accelerating quickly, and, you know, governments and, you know, groups haven't quite caught up with that. You know, designers are right now on that front line, you know, talking about it, but not really sure how to respond, unless they've been working in technology for a very long time. And even though there might be sort of differences in terms of maybe like Midjourney, it appears to be highly creative because you're getting these beautiful slick outcomes, but how creative is creative, and how do we define that? And that goes back to the philosophical debate around AI, you know, whether or not AI should be human competitive or not. So that really is a big deal. And I think a big deal for education as well, because I think in the research currently, and there's a lot of research generated now around AI, because of the publishing cadence picking up over the last few years. There's a prolific amounts of writing out there. Education is under-researched, and so is the area of well-being and human flourishing, and we're human-centered. So therefore, you know, if we call ourselves human-centered, we should be thinking about that. You know, it's a conundrum.
Exactly. That's, I think you just framed it exactly as I was trying to question it. And this is also sort of why I developed Design in Focus the way I have, with the focus on networks and communities. So the area networks and community, so we're here because of Randstad-UX. Randstad-UX is the network that I created as a flagship on how I envision other people to leverage the platform to continue the same. And when in a month or two, I'm going to start on the training and mentoring part of the platform, but they're all related. I think when we're looking at design in the current world, that focus, like you were also confirming, is not there anymore. It's very broad. And so I've developed the different areas to sort of see how that comes together, because I think as designers responding in the real world, there are so many challenges. And I think having networks and communities that lead up to unions, or, you know, inform people about unions and other sources where they can find support and sort of like back up and work out ideas. So Tatiana already knows about the trauma-informed group. But yeah, I wonder why that's not a thing in the larger scale, you know? So it's obviously we're evolving, and then we realize, oh, well, actually we need trauma-informed design. It's not in the curriculums yet. So these people get together, they have a little community, and they're passionate about it, and they try and solve those problems themselves. And so I think that's another element that I'd like to talk about, is how do we, you know, in school, there's a tendency to be the best, you're right or you're wrong, and that creates the in-group, the out-group, the in-group, the out-group. And if we want to have a more just, fair, and equitable future, then that sort of dynamic has to change into, like what you said, being more working in unison as a collective team and not just an individual. So bridging that divide between in-group, out-group to the collective, are there any, what are your thoughts on that?
That's a tough question, because, you know, it's still at the end, schools, especially design schools, still need to teach something. So you still need, you know, there are certain things you have to teach, and they're right or wrong. So, but I feel that just by discussing those topics and giving the chance for the student to all offer their opinion and offer like a safe space for everybody to, you know, say what they really think. I think both of those can be done, as in like, okay, well, we're learning, this is a school, so there's certain things you need to know, But on the other hand, there are plenty of other things. There are either opinion or everybody can have their own idea. So let's just talk about it together.
Mm-hmm. Conversation and having an open dialogue then
Yeah.
is the focus here. All right. Okay, so then I will go to the next question. So when we're talking about critical thinking versus memorization, what are the ways that to individually thrive versus mass testing? To mass. Sorry, I'm struggling with this. I think this was posted by one of the people who responded on LinkedIn. Critical thinking versus memorization, ways to individually thrive versus to mass testing. Yeah, so I think you get it right. It's they're sort of trying to balance the two here. Yeah, that's the actual question. So what are the ways that we can thrive and grow next to mass testing? So I guess this would say we often do not have a voice in the larger picture. But how do we get that voice? So that's also a lot of people memorize words and buzzwords. Everybody's got this buzzword, but they don't have the critical skills and the understanding to understand what those buzzwords actually mean. So balancing buzzwords and actual, the critical thinking versus the memory.
Well, let me just return to the case study that I mentioned earlier, that High Tech High, and there are many other examples, but I think High Tech High is kind of a particularly interesting example of how to address that problem. Memorization is not at all part of their curriculum. It's very much the curriculum is very much based on solving problems, on critical thinking, on being creative, because it's a problem-based curriculum. So that students, as part of their projects, identify a problem. And again, it's very compatible with design as this larger meta concept. They identify a problem, and they, in their year-long project, is working towards solving that problem. And in the course of that, they're not memorizing things. In the course of that, they're applying knowledge about mathematics, about writing, about language, about science, depending, of course, on the problem. And the teacher, as a designer, needs to think critically about the problems that students are identifying as their projects, because of course they are mentoring, shaping the way students think about problems, and is this a manageable problem for the resources that the student has? What are the kinds of skills that the student needs to solve this problem? How do I incorporate that into the lessons that I have today? And none of that involves memorizing, and more likely involves how to incorporate search engines and perhaps even AI into coming up with well-formulated problems and beginning to work on solutions to those problems.
Mm-hmm. I think if I were to frame this question, I've been trying to, because just to make it a little bit more, it was a bit messy. One thing that comes to mind is, for example, best practices. So I've been responsible for following best practices, but I've also been responsible for creating best practices at companies. So you design a style guide, you design a design system, and you give the people using it a list of best practices. And I think if we take, for example, accessibility, the WCAG best practices, there's sort of like a lot of copy paste instances there. And of course, I think for a main part, we can trust the WCAG, however you want to pronounce it. But then within organizations, we get our own best practices, which people like me develop out of, our experiences. Now, some of these best practices, I've followed some of these, are dark patterns or darker designs. So at this point is when your critical thinking should kick in and you'd be able to recognize, okay, that there's something wrong here. So I think that's sort of the question here. How do you, we rely a lot on, like when I'm creating, I don't even think about how I'm moving around in Photoshop. I know Photoshop, don't have to think about it. When you're getting started, you have to learn the interface and you're not quite sure. And the more experience you do, the more you rely on this memory of how things are. You don't sort of rethink it every time. On the 21st, Don was also saying, we need to rethink the issues. But rethinking the issues requires critical skill and not trained skill, not that repetitive skill. So how do we get that critical lens back? And how do we develop an effective critical lens?
I mean, that's the biggest problem forever, like teaching student critical thinking. That was before AI, before anything else. That's always been a trouble. I feel that because of AI, is going to be even more important, because you're going to need to be able to recognize, if it's what is given to you is good, because we can't stop AI. But I feel that, for example, in Europe, and I'm not sure how it is in the Netherlands, but I know in Italy, when you go to school, yes, you had to learn things, but then you had oral exams. Actually oral quiz. So they're not really exams, but they're like quizzes. And that's a great way to demonstrate the critical thinking, because it's not just like, okay, recite what you learn. They're like question about what you're supposed to be learning. So I think instead of doing tests, having critical thinking questions instead of that, and that would help you to see if they really understand. But one other thing I want to mention, and because I did think about it a lot about High Tech High for my son. And he's a great school, and is like, I was saying, is project-based for the most part. So it's a great great But there is one thing I want to point out, is that is a school that doesn't work for every kid. It requires a lot of like self-motivation and self-concentration. Also, one thing that's really cool about the school is like at least some of the schools, they have like transparent, like basically glass walls. And so you cannot to inspire collaboration, but it can, for a kid that, for example, have ADHD, it could be very, very difficult, because the environment, it would not be, apt for that. So I feel that the education generally from kindergarten all the way to college should be reformed, but it also should be adaptable to the point that you can help kids learn in the best way for them. So, and a little bit like I can see, my son went to a Montessori school, and that was a very good, when he was in elementary school, and that was great, because that's it's not project-based because the kids are too young, but that's kind of the idea. Like there is a certain amount of things the student needs to know by the end of the year, but like the way they learn it, it just really follow how the kid kind of leading this learning. But I can also say that I learned my multiplication tables many, many years ago, and I still remember it, versus, it's really hard for my son to do anything in his head. So I think there may be a little space for memorization for certain things and learning certain things, but definitely much more emphasis should be given to the critical thinking, and also maybe a mix of methodology, and see what, because you can't ever find something that's perfect for everyone. But if you offer multiple things, then I feel that it will be easier for the kids, especially younger one, to find the best way for them to learn, and ask lots of questions to the kid. Let them talk.
Yeah, so I think we've already talked quite a lot about education of design, but how about designing education from a designer perspective? What are our influences in how we can shape education? What are the, so if you were to look into your areas right now, where do you see designers most needed to improve education so that it can serve humanity better?
I think that really builds well on what we've just been talking about, the issue of access. So access to all, education is a driver of well-being, so how do we increase that and make education more transferable and accessible for many people? And the way, I wouldn't necessarily say curriculums, I could talk about modalities of training, for example. They're often optimized for people who may be considered, what do you call, a sort of a certain status, without having any analysis around different kinds of statuses based on ability or background or access. So I find that quite problematic, and I'm sure many designers do. And even in the delivery of education, who turns up in my classes, I've worked in professional education and training as well as academic for a number of years. And, usually, appearances can be deceiving, but most people seem to be able-bodied, of a certain demographic. It's usually accessible socioeconomically as well. So who are we excluding is my question. And that's why it's so exciting to see different methods coming into education at, younger ages globally. But I do question whether or not the global South is actually receiving the advantages that, more advanced economies are receiving, and that creates problems for everybody because of what's happening in the world with our environment and the impact in the Asia Pacific and the Pacific region. We have lots of issues around access.
Yeah. Well, I have a lot of thoughts on that, but I don't want to go into that too much because that's a whole another baby. But yeah, as I've definitely, I have very specific points on what I think contributes to that. And I hope maybe we can talk about that in one of the other panels, Catherine, because very interesting. I want to ask you one of the questions from the viewers. How can designers collaborate with educators to co-create learning materials and experiences that cater to diverse learning styles and abilities, fostering inclusivity in education? So we've already mentioned that we need that, but how can we start designing that?
I just want to mention something. I just read, and I don't remember the name, but I just read a really interesting app that is used by some of the schools here, colleges in the United States. They had the broad kind of gamification to grading, for example, in which is like there is a series of activity that you have to complete to finish the class. But the timeline is very flexible, as well as, let's say you need 100 points to pass the class, but if you do all the activity, you will get, let's say, 140. So that means that if you fail one, it doesn't matter. There is really no average or GP, but it's more like, okay, how many points at the end you actually get? And that's kind of a very interesting way of teaching, I think, because then encourage the student to try things. Even if this seems really difficult, maybe beyond their ability, because it's like, well, worst case scenario, I can do another assignment if this one doesn't work. And I think that helps have students be more explorative and with the material and engage a lot more with the material than if they're worried about, oh, I need to get an A on this assignment, or I need to do really well. So I feel that maybe if we could structure learning in a way that is not punitive, but is more explorative, as in like, okay, well, there's that many activities, you choose when and which one based on the material. And then, if you fail one, that's okay, because you can, make it up. So I think it'd be a good way to get students more engaged in the, because they want to, not just because they're worried about failing the class.
When I started my studies, I read an interesting article, but because I was having challenges. I started in law. I did a year of law, and then I did public relations, and then I did multimedia. So it was I have an unusual background. My dad went off the grid when I was 10 or 11, and from that time on, I started living on a farm, and I left school I only did primary school, and then I left school to work on the farm. And I went back to school when I was 17, and I completed high school in 2 years. So I did all 5 years in 2. And then I had to decide what to study, and I didn't know what to study. And one of the issues raised back then was that there was too much choice, and I felt, and I agree. I read it, and I was like, yes, I don't know what to, like, what do I do with this? This can go here, and so I think one, and I don't know if it's still the same, because I haven't been at university for years and years, but one of the major issues that I faced was envisioning a future. So we might have some stereotypes from TV or from some books. Now, these days, we have talks like this where people can access and sort of get more engaged. But when there's so much on the table, how do you choose, and how do you determine what sort of life that will bring you? Difficult questions.
Well,
We can
I would
also
say maybe one thing, and I don't know, I don't even know if I believe it 100%, but I think one thing that I found interesting about university here in the United States, and I'm not talking about the fact that nobody can get in, nobody can pay for it. Let's pretend that doesn't exist. But one thing I found interesting is that you have some general education courses that you have to take. Now, part of it too, because I feel maybe high school don't prepare student enough. But on the other hand, having the chance to spend a little bit of time, like a year or two, to explore different subjects, and then you can make a choice that is a little bit more thought out. Now, it's not a perfect system, because now, especially beside the price, is like you have to declare your major when you try to apply, because it's so impacted. But as an idea, it's kind of interesting that you have a little bit of time to try out a few classes without wasting your time, because it still counts. See if it's like really what you're interested in, and then you can kind of commit. I'm like, okay, this is really what I want to do.
I think it's really great that we have Catherine and you here, because Catherine, we spoke about this briefly the last time we met, and that was the sort of the mental models that comes out of the exclusivity of tertiary education. And then your response was that, in Australia, everybody can study, so you don't have that. And I think here we can see that is still pretty much the case in the US, where it's again that in-group, out-group mentality of, we're elite and you can't get into this group, you can't get into this university. And that's, do you have any sort of stories where you think you can juxtapose the two places, the two very opposite polar experiences of education? Let's see, for example, societies, groups of people, how it's approached in Australia and how it's approached in the US.
Probably less so in the US, because I haven't spent a lot of time in the US as a citizen or a resident, but I've spent time in the United Kingdom, where I actually was a exchange student during my education in my undergrad. And a lot of US-based students were coming over because the international fees were far cheaper than, well-ranked universities in the States. So it's really interesting. Most of the people that I studied with as, international exchange students or international students coming in for the full degree were there, from the United States. And there were people from all sorts of economic backgrounds as a result, I'd imagine comparably, depending on how many people are brought in an intake through scholarship programs and funded programs, funded places, I should say. Here in Australia, we have the same structures with funded places. Backgrounds are considered. If you've gone to a school that perhaps isn't as well serviced with, results averages at the end of the high school phase, which, are score-based outcomes based on your final 2 years, then you may be allocated a priority place based on your background and where you've come from. My partner's from Iceland, so the Scandinavian model is very different. It's open. I think it's more merit-based in that sense, because it's not just about affordability and access. It's also about, just being ready for that course and being able to get admitted into the course. It's very interesting. And I wouldn't say that it's completely equitable. Like I did protest in my undergrad phase against fee introductions and fee increases, federally across our system. And in the 60s, many of our politicians at the time had free education. So, but many people, despite the free education availability, many people didn't go into tertiary education because of, access to roles being developed, in the real world, rather than going through the tertiary route. And now things are considered to be more competitive because more people have degrees. So most people are expected to have degrees. What I like about the high school program and the way it's been articulated in our state-based curriculum is that there is access to both trades and skills-based careers outside of tertiary, in technical colleges, for example, or direct to industry, as well as the other way, because the pandemic highlighted that we needed people who may not be degree qualified, but still in specific roles. So, devaluing those roles through being tertiary qualified and, maybe having that sort of lag with getting people into those industries was highlighted there too. Yeah.
And I think, your lens is also, I think you can answer a little bit more in depth, because you're also in online education. So that is accessible education. And, it's a little bit more unbiased and not from the actual institution, but from the people, because when you're walking around as a student on campus, you've got, there's certain criteria which can create those group mentalities. Whereas if you study online, you have to be motivated by yourself. You have to, get through it. There's nobody sort of to directly answer your questions. And so I think, that dynamic between how it was the original institutional education and now the digital education, will also change the landscape. Do you have any ideas on how it will change the landscape of education, but also design in education?
You don't require a degree to be admitted. You don't have to do any pre-testing to go onto an education platform, which is an advantage. And I should have said professions before than industries. I was thinking, that in itself is value, isn't it? But there's still a threshold. You still need to pay something to have the service provided to you, and to once you're admitted into sort of that past that threshold of payment, then you are needed to, that intrinsic motivation is required, especially if you're a B2C customer. With cohorts that often come into business to business services, it's quite different. We'll have the power learners, people who are really committed to learning and like learning, and then you'll have people who are there because they've been asked to become, credentialed or accredited, I should say, in a different way. So there's we don't provide degrees. We're not affiliated with universities, the business that I work for, although I have worked for other companies that provide online learning services, micro-credentials and degrees and postgraduate studies-based courses online. What we often see is that these are delivered online digitally, but there's also a multimodal or blended learning aspect to the course delivery. So when you're in group settings or cohorts, there's an aspect of helping each other, which is beneficial if you're in a business or sort of organizational context. So there are different sort of aspects of value, being sort of an autonomous learner, a person who's learning on their own versus a person who's part of a cohort and being helped through it. So I'd say that there's lots of aspects there that create access. But again, you go back to the software delivery and the principles and the, adherence to standards, that you need to look at with software. So while it might be open to anyone who can put a credit card out there and say, yes, I can pay, can they actually receive the value? And if it's delivered in a certain way, does it actually support that person's learning and their learning style, if you believe in that theory, or, their learning preferences and the way they prefer to learn? So that's the other aspect to it.
So one thing.
Oh, sorry. I just want to say also, I think in online education, also create a lot of issue of access. Like we saw that with COVID, and I was shocked to find out about 15% of household in San Diego County, which granted is huge, and we're talking mainly rural, but they did not have internet access. And this is like San Diego, California. And, I'm doing a project with some rural counties in Pennsylvania, and the average is about 70% or 75% of people have internet access and 25% don't. And we don't even know what kind of internet. So I think it is more open, but on the other hand, it also not necessarily more accessible because of all those technical difficulties. And like you said, it's also harder to figure it out if is the person really learn. Like there is not, a lot of those courses don't really have any rigorous testing. And it's really hard to do if it's not in person. So I think some companies may not take that credential as in, unless it's like a short certificate your company make you take. But like as a whole course of study, I feel that sometimes some company may not accept it because there's nobody to see if you really did the work.
That's a great example of the sort of differences there. And also, even at tertiary education, I had a private education when I studied multimedia, and when I compare myself in some areas to some of my colleagues, I had a lot more learnings than some people never. We covered ethics in there was a module on ethics, for example, and you don't have it here in Europe. So the standard was pretty good. It was a private school, but when it came to a group of people who had, I can't remember which institution it was, but it was one of the known institutions. And all of a sudden, I was degraded because it wasn't Stanford, it wasn't, or John Hopkins, I think it was John Hopkins. It wasn't. It's not Harvard. So your information is less valuable, and you see that sort of pattern ripple through here as well. It's like, well, online is not in person, and that's again that sort of society. Those societies here in the Netherlands, for example. I spoke to a professor last year, and the main issues that they're facing is these societies in the universities, and they had it with the princess here, where she was maybe in an art group or something like that, and they were really worried about her because the younger people are doing atrocious things to each other. The ones who believe themselves to be the top dog, they violate others, and so that sort of, while it's good to come together, and I advocate for that through networks and communities, maybe unions as well. When we come together, we can also be like pack animals sometimes, like we're the cool kids and you're not welcome, or you're not valid as a human. We may, and in our youth, we're worse than when we're adults. As you get older, you get experience, and you get to, feel for other people because you understand what it feels like. But the younger you are, the more sort of savage, in a lot of cases, you've got to learn to have compassion. Do you see anywhere in both online and at the institutional levels where these sort of ideas are addressed and talked about, and so that we can sort of design the solutions to counter that and make a more fair, equitable, and sustainable world?
Yes, I was thinking about the issues of mental health with remote learning. We saw that a lot during the pandemic. My first, I think it was my second semester. We went into fully online, remote, and we flipped our learning modalities to online, and everything went straight to Zoom. And we also had a lot of students offshore, lots of students from the Asia Pacific region. And I remember the impact on the students, because we went from being in studios with them, having face-to-face learning opportunities, group work, individualized learning, where we could be, there to speak with the students and speak with them after the class as well, or during breaks, to almost this transactional moment, which we had to reduce the transactionality around that. So I think what I saw was, a lot of attention to mental health and responses to students, and really just checking in on, okay, people are off camera, that's okay if that's their preference. We don't want to make that an issue, because you can be more inclusive by having people off camera, but then you can't read the engagement. So outside of, going through the process of actually directly engaging as a facilitator of learning with those students and understanding if they're okay, and that requires a lot of effort on behalf of the lecturer or the academic. So, I was often solo delivering rather than pair delivering my courses. And, I think the evolution of that course became paired delivery, even though it went back to on-site. That was an interesting one. But from the perspective of well-being in the class, I could see paired delivery for remote learning being very important for those students, and seeing the ability, be able to share a bit of space, because we had cohorts that were over 25 to 40 people in a class, being able to distribute your attention and be closer to the students to understand if that learning quality was, okay for them in real time, rather than just in an end of semester survey or end of module survey, which we were paying attention to. but obviously didn't give us the real-time metrics we needed, in terms of a pulse check. So we were introducing a lot of techniques such as, just feedback responses and surveying live rather than, waiting for the institutional survey to go out to help us.
Yeah. And are there any areas that you think design specifically can impact? So not just the design students, but actually designers shaping this, the educational field to improve it, to design the solutions to the challenges in the area.
It comes down to that engagement and relational style that we were talking about before, with domain experts, perhaps, who are education scientists. I've worked with a lot of education scientists in different contexts in SaaS. So, understanding who you can access around, education principles and learning principles that you need to deliver on through the product or service experience that you're designing for in the education setting, where I've designed SaaS as a design professional with learner scientists who have been delivering education, specialists who've been delivering on, course materials and course objectives and structuring their courses, enhancing their actual methods. We've applied canvases into the course creation approach, which is something that we know well in product design and software delivery and innovation. Canvases are often used out there in the world. But in education, that was the first time that these people had worked with canvases before, and working with low to medium to high fidelity course design and working through that. So we didn't start at the high fidelity end. That created it much more multidisciplinary in the way we created courses and included people. And we were able to engage partners and stakeholders through that process, which was great.
Awesome. So I believe we've reached our mark. I know Tiziana is on her way already. So guys, thank you very much for your time and effort here. And it was great having you.
Thank you.
Great discussion. So.
All right. Well, see you next time.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
Wonderful.
Night.
Thanks.
Good morning. Good afternoon.
Good morning. Good afternoon.
Good evening.
Good night to you, Robert, and to me.
Thank you all for being here. It was great having you.
Bye.
Thank you.